very good morning to all of you that is tuning in. Welcome.
Welcome. My name is Caleb.
And my name is Karin. We are honored to be here this morning and we hope that you are ready for this event. So today's webinar is organized by YMI and NextGen. And YMI, which stands for the question.
YMI?
Exactly, Caleb. And it is an online Christian platform that fosters deeper conversations about everyday life. As the young adult arms of our Daily Bread ministries, they produce resources to help you ask the why and know your purpose through a range of written and visual content.
That's nice. And our partners here, NextGen, is the youth arm of DUMC. Yep. They comprise of both the teens and campus ministry. And our vision really in NextGen is to disciple a generation to win a generation. So if you're posting on social media about anything regards to today's event,
tag us.
Please do tag us at YMI_today and also tag us at nextgen.dumc. Or if you feel like it, you can also use the hashtag YMINXG2021, all lower cases.
Right.
So you must be wondering, I'm wondering, are you wondering?
I am.
You must be wondering, how did the two organizations team up in the first place? Well, in 2019, some of you may have attended the YMI Examining the Faith events held either in Singapore, Malaysia, or even Australia.
Yep, and the Malaysia leg was held in collaboration with NextGen at DUMC. And we saw a very encouraging turnout and participation on both nights of the event. As a result, both YMI and NextGen agreed to run this event a second time in 2020. But of course, as we all know, Caleb, COVID happened and all our travel plans were cancelled. But nevertheless, we thank God. We thank God for technology where we can see all of you here this morning, 154 of you here, which has enabled us also to hold this virtual event this year. And regardless of whether we are constrained by physical or geographical boundaries before, now we are not constrained by that anymore, and that's why for today's event we hear there are people tuning in from various countries.
Wow. Which countries are these people coming from?
I heard there are participants from Singapore, from Philippines.
Wow.
And people like us who are in Malaysia, they made a very long journey to join us here this morning. So we welcome all of you, and we really, really hope that you'll find today's event a beneficial one.
Yes. And before we continue on in this event today, we would like to just explain a little bit about this platform, online platform that we are using. So if you're currently maximizing the video feed, we would just welcome you to minimize the full screen mode so that you'll be able to view the chat function, which should be located on the right side of your screen. So over here in this chat box, you'll be able to respond to us via chat. At the same time, this chat box will also be where all the links that we'll be mentioning today, it will appear there. Moreover, if you look at the bottom right corner of your screen, you will see 3 little emojis over there. So these are ways in which you can react to us as well as the audience to let us know what excites you and what are you feeling in the moment. So there is the heart emoji. Yep, the heart emoji. There is the clap emoji.
And we see some coming on the chat.
Yes, nice. And then lastly, there is the cheer emoji.
Woo! So please feel free, tap on these emoticons, encourage us so that we know you can hear us, you can see us loud and clear, and we would love to interact with all of you.
That's right. So moving on from that, so yes, talking about the chat, let us see whether you guys understand or know how to use it. Right. So as we mentioned, there's plenty of people coming from all over the region.
Right.
So right now in the chat, get ready. We want to hear from you. Okay. Where are you tuning in from this very morning? Okay. So if you are in and you're in the chat, could you just let us know which country you're tuning in from? And we would love to hear from you.
Yes, please. So introduce yourself. Let us know which country you're from, and we would love. Oh, we've got Joseph tuning in from Brunei. Hi, Joseph.
That is
nice
great.
to meet you.
Nice to meet you.
Anyone else? So we've got some tuning in from Malaysia. We've got Samuel
John from India. All the way from India. Thank you for joining us this morning. You got some other people from Malaysia again. And then we have someone
Hi,
from
Malaysians.
Singapore.
Singapore,
Ken.
Philippines.
John from Singapore.
And
Nice.
we've got, Gwen from Philippines.
Janina from Singapore as well. Nice. There's someone tuning in from their bed. Wonderful. Where is your bed located? That will be interesting to know. You have a few people from Indonesia as well. So nice to see you guys here. Selamat pagi to all of you from Indonesia as well.
I can speak, Caleb, I can speak a little bit of Tagalog.
Go ahead. Welcome our friends in Tagalog.
Good morning. Good morning is, if I'm pronouncing this correctly, it's actually Magandang Umaga. So Gwen from Philippines, please let me know if I'm pronouncing this correctly. And I also know that thank you means, or how do you say thank you? Salamat. So salamat for tuning in, all of you.
That is
let's
great.
see, who else?
We even have someone tuning in all the way from Canada. Chloe, welcome this morning.
Hello everyone. We hope you are awake and excited. Clearly you can tell from us, we are truly, truly excited to be here.
Yes, and you know why we are excited? We're excited because we had our breakfast already.
I had my coffee.
Yeah, see, she had her coffee. I can't take coffee, so it's fine. But we'd like to hear from you now, right? Knowing that you guys are tuning in from all over the world. What did you guys have for breakfast if you did have your breakfast? So if you could let us know in the chat as well. That would be great to know. What did you guys have for breakfast this very morning?
Caleb, what do you have for breakfast this morning?
What I have for breakfast? I had the very same thing that you had, which was nasi lemak. The best...
breakfast for champions.
Breakfast for champions, that is right. And it's the national breakfast of Malaysia.
Among the many others. So let us know what you have had for breakfast. Let us see. We can actually see what you are writing on the chat. So please continue to respond and type in. We are seeing, we've got some of you, we've got Joseph who had kolomi.
Nice.
That is, I think, a Sarawak dish.
That's right. I think so too. You got someone who had ramen for breakfast from Cam. Wow, that's a very nice breakfast actually.
Yeah.
Some people had kopi o kosong. I think that's panda lim. Nice.
Curry laksa and some chocolate drink. Best combination ever. Clearly, Caleb, you can see that we take our food very, very seriously.
That's right. Waterman had purified water for breakfast.
Consistent to the theme.
Wonderful.
We've got someone all the way from LA as well.
Welcome.
Good morning. What time is it there, by the way?
Yes. So if you guys had something especially that's unique to your country for breakfast, we would definitely love to hear what it is. And if you could, maybe just explain it to us as well so that we know what dish it is. It'd be great to actually hear from all of you from all around the region.
Yeah. So if we were to ask you, what is your national breakfast for the country that you're from, what would it be? Caleb, what is Malaysia's national breakfast, you think?
Oh man, I think it's nasi lemak, but I think there's a lot of options as well. You have roti canai. I think that's a great breakfast as well. I don't know, what else is there? What else do you think is a national breakfast for us in Malaysia?
What else? Let me think. We've got nasi lemak, we've got roti canai. Well, some of us, we have bak kut teh for breakfast. So bak kut teh is actually a herbal pork dish. So we have it for breakfast, for lunch, for dinner, for supper.
Yeah, I think it's one thing that's quite unique about us in Malaysia is that whatever we have for breakfast could be taken for lunch as well, and sometimes even dinner.
Yeah.
So yeah, we'd like to hear more from you guys. What do you guys have for breakfast? Let us know in the chat.
Please do. And Caleb, I heard when we were in, so we went to Philippines about 3 years back with some of our friends.
Yeah, 3-4 years ago.
And Caleb had the delicacy of Philippines. He enjoyed it thoroughly. He was explaining, his experience of eating balut, right?
Yes, we did try balut one fine night while in the Philippines, me and a couple of friends. And it was interesting, I would say, at the very least. It was definitely a unique experience.
So for us who don't really know what balut is, what exactly is balut?
So it's balut. Those of you who are tuning in from Philippines, if I'm explaining it wrongly, please feel free to correct me.
Please.
But from what I understood and what I experienced, balut basically was a duck egg with a duck embryo developing in the egg, which is basically hard-boiled. You would then normally dip it with vinegar or some form of spices to add some flavoring to it. But yeah, so that's it depends on what you like in your egg, I suppose. So I prefer my eggs cooked with just eggs. But yeah, so it's unique, definitely. And it was a good experience. It was interesting, definitely, to experience a different culture.
Yeah. So we really love traveling and I think getting to know the different cultures. And again, we would love to know the rest of you who are tuning in live this morning. So if you have just came in, we would like to wish you a very good morning. My name is Karine.
And my name is Caleb.
And we are tuning in from Malaysia.
Right. So we see from Nat as well, he had banana, bread, and peanuts. That is a pretty healthy breakfast, I would say. Yeah. So, yeah, continue, guys. If there's any one of you who would like to just let us know what you had for breakfast, we would love to hear from you.
Yes. And please feel free to use the public chat to share your thoughts. If you have any questions, also put in there. Let us know how you're feeling. Use the emojis, the heart shape, the hand clap, and even the cheer so that we know you can hear us loud and clear. I just saw some emoticons coming up. Thank you very much for responding to us.
That's right. So just a reminder, if you hear us talking about this chat function, but if you can't see it, then most probably you are actually, you're having your video feed maximized. So all you need to do is to actually just zoom out, is to minimize the video feed so that the chat bar will appear on the right side of your screen.
Exactly, and we can see your feedback live here. So please feel free to put in. As I can see now, we have 208 participants tuning in with us this morning.
Wow, that's quite a few of you guys this early in the morning. So thank you for joining us. Yeah. So welcome again. Good morning, Fal. Thank you for joining us this very morning. It is great to have you with us.
Yes, and we see a lot of hashtags coming up. So please do tag us at YMI_today and at nextgen.dumc if you would like to post anything regarding the event today. If you have pictures to share with us, if you're tuning in with some of your friends, do take a group picture, tag us so that we can all feel connected and you know, we will feel like you are right with us.
That's right. Or if you like to, you can also just use the hashtag YMI_NXG2021. The alphabets are all in lower cases. So do that, and we can even find out at the end of the day where you guys are tuning in from, and it'll be great to be able to see all of you on social media. Right?
Yes.
Welcome again, Max. Good morning to you, and Florence as well. Thank you for joining us this morning.
Yes, again, if you have missed it earlier, if you are tuning in from a country other than Malaysia, please feel free to let us know in the chat where you are tuning in from, and we would love to welcome you. So Max, good morning. I see your post. Florence as well. The rest of you, any other countries are represented here that we have not mentioned? So earlier we've got Singapore.
Yeah.
We've got Philippines.
You have someone from Canada even?
Oh, Canada. I missed that. We've got someone from Canada. Yeah. Where exactly in Canada are you from? Oh, we've got someone from Hong Kong.
That's nice.
Do you know how to speak Cantonese?
No. My safe answer is no.
So good morning would be 早晨.
Yes.
I think.
That's right. I think that's
Are you
correct.
sure?
I think that's correct.
早晨, 大家好. Hi, Bet. Nice to meet you. Thank you for tuning in with us.
There we go.
There
that's
we
a
go.
response.
Oh, we've got someone tuning in from Bangalore, India. Wow.
Nice to meet you, Nat. Thank you for joining in to this very morning.
And unfortunately, I do not know how to say good morning in your language. So, Nat, if you don't mind, you can put it in and let us know how do we say good morning. Or how do you guys wish one another good morning in India if you know there is a special way of doing so.
Nice. All right. So without further ado, let's go into the first session for today. And to do that, we'll introduce our speaker for session 1. So Max Jagannathan is an international speaker and director of Thinking Faith. He is passionate about helping people make sense of current issues and life's big question through the lens of the Christian message.
Yep. And if you're wondering what his profession was before he became a speaker, because he was not a speaker his entire life, Max is actually a former lawyer and a political and policy advisor in Australia. Wow, that's a mouthful.
Yeah.
But Max is currently actually undertaking a PhD in law. He lives in Australia with his wife Fiona and their 2 young kids. Max actually enjoys watching movies.
Nice.
He told us, he loves watching basketball with his friends and playing with his kids. So that is a quick intro on our speaker, Max, this morning. So let's welcome
Max Jagannathan.
The recent Netflix TV series Squid Game has kind of taken the online streaming world by storm and broken all kinds of records. It tells a story of a dystopian and mysterious game where people who are struggling with financial, emotional, and other kinds of hardship are effectively enticed into this game where a series of children's games are played to the death for an enormous cash prize. And through Squid Game, throughout the different episodes of the series, various themes come out about the big questions of life, about some of the most important things about what it means to be human, whether it's in relation to trust or betrayal or pain or self-sufficiency and self-actualization, community, fellowship, friendship, all kinds of themes pour out. But the big underlying theme that runs through the heart of Squid Game's narrative arc is that of suffering. How do people understand suffering? How do people deal with suffering? How do people survive suffering? And the reason that Squid Game is quite telling, as is the case with so much of our art, our movies, our music, our literature, is that it tells us a lot about the prevailing cultural narrative about suffering today. Now, there's plenty that could be said, but broadly speaking, there are 3 responses to suffering that we see in Squid Game, and they're the same 3 responses that we see in our world in 21st century post-industrial society. The first is avoidance. There's a human instinct, of course, and you can understand why. It's very natural to try and avoid suffering. Secondly, escape. When we are in suffering, there is a very natural tendency to want to escape, to just want to get away from it somehow. And many people in Squid Game even enter the game in order to escape the suffering in their lives. Everyone's looking for a quick escape from suffering. But when avoidance doesn't work, and escape doesn't work, and everything we have done in our own strength to try and get out of and get away from suffering doesn't work, the saddest and the third response, which we see again evidently in that TV show, is resignation. Resignation to suffering. And when I say resignation, I mean kind of a sad, lamenting despair and acceptance of suffering. These characters ultimately, almost all of them, realize that there is no way out of their suffering, and they become resigned to it. They accept it, not in a stoic or in a resilient way, but almost in kind of a sad, recoiling kind of way. Avoidance, escape, and ultimately resignation. That's how the world tells us to try and deal with suffering. Try to avoid it if you can. Try to escape it if you can't avoid it. And ultimately, you just have to resign yourself to it. Now, the sad reality of the human condition is that suffering is intrinsic to everyday life. Whoever you are, whatever you believe, we are all dealing with some aspect of suffering right now. If not directly in our lives, then in the lives of those we love. Suffering is ubiquitous to the human condition. We live in a broken world, and we are intrinsically, on some level, broken and imperfect too. And because of that, suffering is going to be real. Now, what does that mean for you and me? What it means is, regardless of what we believe, regardless of whether we are religious, irreligious, theistic, atheistic, what worldview we subscribe to, what philosophy and ideals and morals we live by, regardless of all of that, every single one of us has to come up with a coherent and a practically livable response to the problem of suffering. The problem of suffering is real for all of us, and therefore all of us, no matter what we believe, have to be able to make sense of it and respond to it. So this question of suffering is not just a question for the Christian or for the Christian God or for the Christian Bible. It's a question for everyone. But I want to share with you today just 3 of the aspects of the Christian response to suffering. There's plenty more that could be said, but here are 3 things to think about in relation to the Christian response to suffering. And they all come in response to the way this question is often articulated. If God is real, why is there suffering? I want to talk about 3 aspects of who God is, because the question is so often asked in relation to God. These 3 things. This Christian God, this God of the Bible, is a God of love, is a God who knows, and is a God who cares. A God of love, a God who knows, and a God who cares. First of all, he's a God of love. Now, we say that God loves, and that's true, and he offers us the highest benchmark for love that human history has ever discovered or had been revealed to them. But not just that, love is not just something God does or that he calls us to do or demonstrates for us. It's also an essential characteristic of the Christian God. God is love. That's a uniquely Christian sentence. God doesn't just love, he is intrinsically loving. And so love embodies and infuses everything, in some sense, everything that God does, including his very creation of the world and of you and me. So God creates primarily out of love. He wants a world, he wants a universe where love is possible. For that to happen, he had to create in such a way that love could most purely manifest itself. And how does that happen? That happens in relationship. It happens in friendship. Love is made most real and most authentically on display in friendship and relationship. Now, I know that we use the word love in equivocal ways. We say things like, I love fried chicken, and then I love my friends, or I love my husband, or I love my girlfriend or boyfriend. But we know that in its purest form, we're talking about love in the context of other people, not what we eat and what video games we play and what books we read. Love in its purest form finds flight in relationship, in friendship. And so for a God who is love, wanting to build a world where love was not just possible, but possible in its purest form, he had to also make relationship possible. Now, for relationship and friendship to be possible, people had to be, at least on some level, free to choose to enter into those friendships and relationships and to love in those friendships and relationships. Love on some level has to come with choice. We have to have the freedom to love. Otherwise, it's not truly love. Each of our friendships are worth nothing if we are forced into them, if we are blackmailed into them, if we are extorted into them. One of the reasons that relationship between people is meaningful and beautiful is because we have the choice to enter those relationships and to love within those relationships. And because of that, for love to be real, relationship has to be possible. For relationship to be authentic, freedom and choice to love in those relationships has to also be possible. And of course, the natural outworking of the freedom to love is the freedom not to love. And so with this capacity for love that God has given us, the capacity for right, loving relationships with each other and with him, comes also the freedom not to love. And that freedom, sadly, can also be articulated with the word hate, evil, oppression, discrimination, subjugation, whatever it might be, abuse, mistreatment, misconduct. These are all human beings using their freedom to love for things other than love. And when we look at so much of the suffering in the world today, it's actually moral suffering. It's caused by people. It's caused by us, using our freedom to love for things other than love. We build international systems, financial systems, economic systems, systems of people movement, legal systems, industrial systems that cause the suffering of other people, whether it's poverty or famine or inequality or climate change or even pandemic viruses. These are all brought about by us and caused to spread and expand by us. We actually have a lot to answer for when we consider the question, why is there so much suffering? But we can track it back to God's loving nature. He wants love to be possible, so he made us capable of love. By doing that, he also made us capable of not loving. In the 20th century alone, we killed more of each other than in all preceding 19 centuries put together. So much of the moral suffering and moral evil is because of us misusing the capacity for love, misusing the choice we have been given to love. So at least in part we can see that the reason for suffering, we can make sense of some of the suffering, at least philosophically and theologically, because this God of the Christian Bible, this God of the Christian gospel, is a God of love. Secondly, he's a God who knows. Now this is important because we often come to God with the question, if you are real God, why is there suffering? By trying to approach God on the same epistemological and intellectual level, meaning what we are assuming when we come to God with these questions is, whatever you know, God, I should know. If there's anything to know, I should know it as well. We don't understand that we don't necessarily have access to all of the information, nor do we even have the intellectual capacity to understand all of the information. But the reality is, when we step back and think about it, if God is who he says he is, and you and I are who he says we are, then necessarily there are going to be things that we can't understand and that we don't understand. My son, who's 4 years old right now, is not very good at multivariate calculus. It's not because he's stupid. It's partially because he just hasn't developed intellectually in that way yet to be able to understand that. He will one day, but he doesn't today. The second reason is no one's taught him. I haven't taught him, his teachers haven't taught him. They're teaching him a lot, but they haven't taught him multivariate calculus yet. In the same way, there is an epistemic gap between you and I and God. We are down here and he is up here. And the distance between us and him is infinitely greater than the distance between us and a child. And so we shouldn't be confused when there are aspects of our reality and our existence and our experience that we simply can't make sense of and understand. And in my view, suffering is the greatest example of that. There is no reasonable basis on which we should expect to understand everything there is to know about human suffering. There's a lot that we can understand, and in explaining God as a God of love and identifying the moral suffering that we cause, I hope I've uncovered some of it for you. But we're kidding ourselves if we think that we can understand all of it. In fact, if we could understand everything about everything about everything, then there probably would be no God. If God is real, then necessarily there would need to be things that we don't understand. We are created by him, therefore we have lower intellectual capacities, lower cognitive capacities, and a different lower epistemic state. We just don't have access to the information he has. If I opened a garage and said to you that there's an empty garage here, no car, just some suitcases and some tools on the side, maybe a few cobwebs, and I said to you, there is a tiger in the garage, you would assume I was crazy or drunk or deluded or didn't know what a tiger meant, or I was joking. But if I said there is a spider in the garage and you saw the exact same thing, in the first instance, you couldn't see the tiger. In the second instance, you can't see the spider. In the second instance, you wouldn't be so quick to jump to the conclusion that I was crazy or joking or drunk or deluded. Why is that? Because if there was a spider in the garage, you wouldn't necessarily see it. It could be there even though you couldn't see it. It might be in a crack, it might be in the light, it might just be somewhere out of your vision. In the same way, some of the reasons for suffering are better thought about like a spider in the garage than a tiger in the garage. Just because we don't know, just because we don't understand, it doesn't mean those reasons don't exist. And that's what the philosophers call a category error. And it's a category error that we all make all too often. It comes from an intellectual arrogance of misunderstanding the epistemic gap between us and God. We assume that just because something is real, that it needs to be understandable and available to me as readily digestible information. Just because something is true doesn't mean I know it. And just because I don't know something doesn't mean it's not true. There are plenty of truths out there that I don't know the answers to. Doesn't mean that those answers aren't out there. In the same way, I know plenty of explanations for the suffering and the reality of the brokenness of the world. Because God tells us in his word that there are, but that we just don't know. We can't fathom. We haven't been told. We can't comprehend. We haven't been given access to that information yet. So God is a God of love. He's also a God who knows. And we need to just rest and trust in his understanding and in the majesty of who he is. So God does ask us. He says, I'm going to explain to you some of why there is suffering. But with some of it, it's like a spider in the garage. You just have to trust me. He calls us to trust him with the things that we don't understand in relation to evil and suffering in this world. The next question we should ask him then is, okay, God, you've asked us to trust you with the things we don't understand. That all makes perfect logical sense. It's perfectly coherent. But on what basis should we trust you? That's a good question to ask. We should always be quick when anyone says, trust me, to say, on what basis? Thankfully, this God doesn't call us to trust him blindly. He gives us the greatest basis for trustworthiness in human history. So we move to our third point. Having considered God as a God of love and God as a God who knows, we now look at God as a God who cares. Now, it's interesting. In Squid Game, I talked about those three instinctive responses to suffering: trying to avoid it, trying to escape it, and ultimately just resigning ourselves to it. But the funny thing is, all those three responses are not actually what people need in suffering. When we look at our lived experience, when we look at our hearts and we look at the data sets out in our lives, what we actually need in suffering is quite simple. It's two things. First of all, we need comfort and strength in the suffering to get through it. Secondly, we need hope beyond the suffering. We need comfort and strength in it to help us to get through it, and we need hope beyond it. Now, before I get to the Christian response, I want to briefly look at how other worldviews and other categories of worldview respond to suffering, and then we can match them up and evaluate the degree to which they fulfill our need for comfort and strength and hope beyond suffering. So, obviously I don't have time to go into every single one in detail, but there are, broadly speaking, 4 other categories of worldview out there. One category of worldview, when it comes to suffering, says there is a God. There is a God out there. He's all-powerful, he's almighty, he's all-sovereign, but he has no moral or relational connection with you or me. And because of that, you don't get to ask him the question about suffering. If you're suffering, that's just his will, and you just have to shut up and take it. And you have to just trust him blindly, without basis. There's another category of worldview that says that all suffering is the fault of the sufferer. If you or I are suffering, it's because of something we have done, either in this life or perhaps in a previous life. It's karmic. All suffering is karmic. There's a third category of worldview that says all suffering is an illusion. The only reason that you're suffering, or I'm suffering, is because we have grown desires for things and we have deluded ourselves into this state of desire. We're too connected to the world. We're too connected to our children, so when we lose one, we suffer. We're too connected to our job, so when we lose our job or we fail in our jobs, we suffer. We're too connected to our friendships, so when we experience betrayal, we suffer. And so the response of this category of worldview is to meditate ourselves to a point of consciousnesslessness, of the extinction of the self, some kind of nirvana where we don't even exist as a self anymore, and therefore there won't be any more desire, and therefore there won't be any more suffering. And then there's the fourth and final category of worldviews, of which there are several, but these are the atheistic worldviews that all postulate that there is no God. And when they are being honest, their response to suffering is that suffering is meaningless. Because everything is meaningless. As Richard Dawkins writes, we are nothing but time plus matter plus chance. And because all of life is meaningless, everything that happens in life has only synthetic and constructed meaning, including suffering. Life is meaningless, so suffering is meaningless. So once again, just shut up and take it. And it's really from that strand of thinking and that worldview that we get these 3 instinctive responses to suffering that drive so much of the cultural narrative today, which we see in Squid Game, that instinct to avoid suffering or to escape it or just to resign ourselves from it. Now, when we look at all 4 of these categories of worldviews, some of them theistic, some of them atheistic, one thing is clear to me, and I'm sure is clear to you. They don't offer the 2 things that we all need. They don't offer comfort and strength within the suffering, and they certainly don't offer hope of a future beyond the suffering. So we look at all of that, and then we look in stark contrast at the message of Jesus Christ, the gospel of Jesus Christ, and most specifically, the cross of Jesus Christ. Because in the Christian response to suffering, we don't have a God who sits off in the distance and says, it's just his will, shut up and take it. We don't have a God who says, it's all your fault, it's all karmic. We don't have a God that says, just meditate yourself into nothingness because you need to desire less and be connected to less in this world. And we don't have a God who says it's all meaningless. We have a God who understands the reality, the tragedy, the pain, the anguish, the despair of human suffering. He understands it so much so that he literally steps down into the world as a person. He literally steps down into our suffering, in human history, Jesus Christ, and goes to a cross and takes all of the suffering, all of the brokenness, the anxiety, the guilt, the shame, the despair. He takes it all onto himself and takes the penalty for it. He dies on a cross and then rises from the dead, defeating all of the suffering, and in doing so, affirming his divinity, affirming who he is, God himself as a person. And now, because of that, is able to offer you and me an up-close and personal relationship with him, a living relationship with him, through which we get the exact two things that all human hearts need: comfort and strength in the suffering, and an eternal hope of a future where there's no more suffering at all. The cross of Jesus Christ brings together love, justice, mercy, hope, and relationship, and in doing so defeats death and suffering. It's the greatest response to human suffering in human history that we see, and it's performed and demonstrated by God himself, a God of love, a God who knows, and a God who cares. Thanks for listening.
Thanks, Max, for the great video with so much gems as we navigate through a tough topic of suffering.
So if you echo that as well, for those of us who are tuning in, do respond with the emoticon so that we know that was a beneficial session for you as well. We would love to hear what are some of the key takeaways that some of you have gotten. So please feel free to share that in the chat as well. Caleb, I'm seeing a lot of emoticons coming up.
Yeah.
Everyone has enjoyed that session through the emojis that I'm seeing on our screen.
Yeah. It's great to be able to see you guys react. So like Karine mentioned, it would be great to hear one takeaway that you have from the session that we just had. So maybe I could share my takeaway from the session. So for me, one of the things that really stood out to me was him when he shared that just because I don't understand everything, it's fine. It's fine. It's expected to not understand everything. And just because I don't understand everything, I don't have to worry about that, because I think that's the difference of us being man and there being a God. So I think that helps me to be able to face suffering, knowing that I don't have to be overwhelmed with the question of why. And yeah, I think that's one thing for me. What about you, Karine?
Yeah, I think Caleb, you brought up a really good point, and I think why the session was such a good one that really all of us can resonate with, because really the topic of suffering is so universal.
Yeah, especially in the past 2 years.
Exactly. How we define suffering is very different for you and I.
Yeah, for sure.
But what Max has shared has really reminded me, I think personally, as I was taking down notes, one thing that he mentioned is that, if God is real, there needs to be things that we don't understand. Because he created us. And just because something is true, it doesn't mean that I know it. So on what basis then do I hold this truth, is that God is a God who cares? And I thought that really brought so much hope, so much assurance, even for myself personally, to know that we have a God who understands.
Yes.
We have a God who we can hope in him beyond my understanding, beyond your understanding as well. So yeah, I thought that was that one key takeaway that I have gotten from Max's sharing.
For sure. And you can see in the chat right now that there's quite a few of you who have shared your takeaway as well. Maybe, for example, you can hear from some of them.
Yeah, so we've got Haley who said that just because something is true doesn't mean I know it. Exactly, Haley, I agree with that. I resonate with that. And also, it is true vice versa. Just because something isn't true doesn't mean I wouldn't know it as well. So that is that whole two sides, to things. We've got Ashley who's agreeing with us to say so good. Yes, Ashley, we agree with you as well.
That's right.
Even for the emoticons that are coming up, a lot more who is agreeing with you as well. And we've got Cynthia who shared something on the chat as well, Caleb.
Yeah, I think Cynthia mentioned hope beyond suffering is a very comforting thought. And I think that's so true, especially in this day and age. And I think I would take that point and connect that with even Samuel's point, where he mentions that doubt is not the opposite of faith. I think that's so important. And that's something that I've experienced as well during this whole past 2 years in the pandemic, where I'll be lying if I said there were days that that every day I'm okay, every day I'm without doubt.
Yeah.
But knowing that doubt is not the opposite of faith, I think is a comforting thought for sure.
Wow.
For someone who is an overthinker like myself.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Same. I too overthink sometimes, most times. And it is a very intentional and conscious, decision to not overthink things, to go back, to what God says. Yeah. And I think that resonated with quite a few of you actually. Yeah. You said, you are assured, and this was such a reminder that we have an eternal hope beyond suffering.
For sure.
And this is a hope that is certain, that we can be certain of as well in the times of uncertainties that we are in.
Yeah, for sure. Let's read out a few other responses from you guys. So for Lucy, I think, Lucy shared that God is pure, holy, love. Satan, on the other hand, was an angel created by God. Where did the spirit of evil come from? So Satan rebelled against. Oh, that's a question there. Sorry, it was not a sharing.
Thank you, Lucy, for your questions. Yes, guys, please feel free to put in your questions. We've got a Q&A session later on as well. So keep it coming.
Yes,
keep it coming, and also keep your takeaways coming in.
Yeah.
We would love to hear from each and every one of you.
Yeah, Gwen has an amazing response there that I would like to share with the rest of you as well. Christ showed the greatest response to suffering, that we don't have to face it as hard anymore.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. What an enlightenment, Gwen. Thank you so much for reminding us of that as well. And Kevin also mentioned, we cannot imagine, he cannot imagine life without Christ, and knowing Christ gives him strength to go through uncertainties and suffering. Wow. Thank you so much for sharing that, Kevin.
That's right.
Thank you, everyone, for sharing your takeaways. Please, again, feel free to continue to put in your chats. We would love to hear from you. I'm sure the rest of us would also love to hear from one another.
For sure.
Because, when we look at things differently. We've got different perspectives, and that's how we learn, from one another. Yes. So with that, we would waste no time. We would go into the second session. And I hope all of you are ready for our second speaker. So our second speaker is none other than Jordan Tyre. So Jordan has worked as a chemical engineer before moving to the UK to study Christian apologetics at the Oxford Centre.
Wow.
And now he is back to Perth to study theology, Caleb.
Senior pastor at Providence Midland. He lives in Perth Hills currently with his wife, 2 daughters, and their dog, Bandit.
Cute. So let's welcome
Jordan
Tyre.
I remember being in a second-year engineering class and hearing one of my lecturers speak about the drag coefficient on a fish's fin. Not something you'd often hear about, but it was a fluid mechanics class. And the lecturer just made an offhand comment that this is either the result of millions of years of evolution, or he said Christians believe this was created by God. And I remember sitting there in the class, like keeping my head down, and the rest of my lecture theatre kind of laughing when he said this could be a special creation by God. And I remember just sitting there thinking to myself, gee, he's just spoken about a irreducible complexity that would literally render fish extinct if their fins weren't designed in exactly this way with this kind of drag coefficient. And people are laughing that could have been created specially like that. I remember thinking, man, that maybe they haven't given this much serious thought, because belief in God is now kind of akin to belief in Santa. It's nothing more than delusional, wishful thinking that makes people feel better. It's thought by many, and I felt this, at least in my engineering class, that science has disproved God. At uni, I was one of only a few Christians in my course of 120 chemical engineers, and it made me really wrestle with this whole question of God and science. Most essentially of all, is Christianity true if it makes claims about the natural world that science has potentially falsified? And so for me, I really had to do some research and do some digging to see, why should you or I or anyone be a Christian? And for me, it seemed obvious that the only reason why anyone should be a Christian is if it's true. Did it accurately describe and make sense of reality? I graduated from engineering and then worked as a process engineer in the oil and gas industry for a few years, and then went on to think a bit more deeply, philosophically and theologically about the relationship between God and science at Oxford University, and then did a master's in theology here in my home city of Perth. And so I've worked as someone working in the sciences, and also someone as a pastor helping people think through the big questions of life. And I've kind of spent half my adult life in both the science and theological worlds. And so I feel the relevance and the importance of this question: why should we bother with the topic of God and science? Well, initially we should care about this topic because for many people it stops them from placing their faith or trust in God, because they've been told to choose between a false set of alternatives, either science or belief in God. And this is made especially popular with the new atheist movement that said, particularly after 9/11, that religion is not only wishful thinking, but it's actually dangerous. And so as we consider this narrative that science and belief in God are in conflict, it's worth noting right from the start that the Bible does not set up science and belief in God as competing explanations for our world. In fact, the Bible makes the claim that God is evident in his creation, not proved, but evident, meaning God can be perceived from what has been made. So rather than God and the natural sciences being in competition, the scriptures say that our study of the natural world should help us know something about God. And at the start of explaining what God is doing in the world, the Apostle Paul makes the bold claim that the creation itself actually reveals there is a God. He says in Romans chapter 1, verse 20, that since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made, so that people are without excuse. For although they knew God, they neither glorified him as God nor gave thanks to him. See, scripturally, this topic matters because the Bible says that the evidence of God, his fingerprints on creation, are sufficient enough to prompt us towards giving him thanks and praise for all that he's done. There is sufficient evidence to know from the world around us that there is a God, but it says that people in their rebellion and sinfulness have suppressed that. And so this matters because we should have responded with thanks to God, but we haven't. Those words at the beginning of Genesis, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth, make a bold claim that this world is not all that there is. There is a God who created it and stands outside of it. But secondly, those words are massively significant for you and me because it says that this world, and indeed us as people, are not an accident. God wanted you to exist. We are not just the end product of time plus chance plus matter. But I think we need to dig deeper a little bit into this question of has science disproved God, because I think it's obvious that it's not a simplistic conflict between science and belief in God when we just look at the scientists we may know personally or that are out there. So growing up, one of my physics tutors and friend and mentor was a guy by the name of Dr. Paul Stanwyck. So he did his postdoc at Harvard University in the US in quantum physics, one of the most brilliant and intelligent people I've ever met. He's a believer in God. Then when I was living in Oxford a number of years later, one of my buddies from the triathlon club, Ollie, again, brilliant world-class scientist, doing his PhD or DPhil in Oxford and Cambridge language in theoretical physics, he was an atheist. Now, what separated these two guys was not their scientific pedigree or even accomplishments. It was actually a deeper level of conflict or disagreement. It was their worldview. One, which is atheistic materialism, which says that this world is all that there is, matter and energy is all that there is, and theism, which says that this universe is not all that there is. There is a God who created it. There is a spiritual realm or dimension. And so the conflict is not actually between science and belief in God. The conflict is between materialism and theism. And there are top scientists on both sides. And so the real question that you and I need to ask as we examine this is, which worldview best fits the evidence? Where does the evidence point? Is it more reasonable to believe that there is a God, or to believe that stuff is all that there is? And so, in order to make sense of the evidence, I want us to look at 4 main categories. First off, just the history of science itself. Secondarily, the philosophy of science. How do we do science? Thirdly, the limits of science. What can and can't science do? And then lastly, some results of science. So first off, the history of science. Within science lies the necessary assumption that the universe is orderly. We take this for granted now, but where did this idea come from? Well, Nobel Prize winner in biochemistry, Melville Calvin, says that this idea was discovered 2,000 or 3,000 years ago by the ancient Hebrews, namely that the universe is governed by a single God and is not the product of whims of many gods, each governing their own province according to their own laws. This view seems to be the historical foundation for modern science. This is a dynamite quote, because what this Nobel Prize winner is saying is that belief in a single God, rather than hindering science, actually prompted people to do it, because they believed that there was an order and a consistency to the external world. So it's problematic right from the beginning to say that science has rendered belief in God unnecessary, because historically belief in God was actually the motor that got the scientific method going. As every Christian talk needs to reference C.S. Lewis at one point or another, let's put that in there. C.S. Lewis says this: people became scientific because they expected law in nature, and they expected law in nature because they believed in a lawgiver. Next up, that's the history of science, the philosophy of science. There are within science what's called philosophical assumptions that you need in order to do science at all. All scientists have the belief, a faith commitment you could say, that our minds can make sense of the universe. This belief is needed before you could even start investigating the universe. And this is what led Sir John Polkinghorne of Cambridge University to say, this is the faith that all atheists or theists must share. It's actually a myth to think that science is in the area of pure facts, while religion is the area of faith. Scientists have faith in their brain's ability to make sense of the external world, to believe that reality out there is accessible to the human mind in here. They have faith that the universe is able to be known. So you must believe that in order to study it. And this is something called a philosophical assumption. It is not something you can prove with the scientific method. It's something you need to assume in order to do science at all. But here's the thing. If we are the end product of a mindless, unguided process, then we cannot trust our brains or any belief they produce, because the human mind would not be geared for truth but for survival. So why would you believe anything that your brain tells you as a truth statement rather than just as something which has utility for survival? So you'd have no way of knowing whether what your brain was telling you was just beneficial or whether it was actually true. Would you trust your computer if you knew that there were bugs and errors in the programming process? Well, of course not. The careful programming means that you trust the output. But why would you trust your brain if you found out that the programming that went in was just random and chaotic and geared towards pragmatic survival? Which is why Professor John Lennox of Oxford University, who's one of my lecturers back in the day, says atheism doesn't just shoot itself in the foot, which is painful. He said it shoots itself in the brain because it actually undermines any trust that you would have in the output of your mind. Now, there is a popular way of arguing that God and science are competing explanations for the world around us. It's called the God of the Gaps approach. The God of the Gaps approach is sadly common, and historically it was far too readily called on. It says, I don't understand how it works, therefore God did it. But the outcome of that way of thinking is that as the gaps in your knowledge close in, so does your need for God. But true theism is not believing in God as an alternative explanation to science. He's not the God of the gaps. He's the God of the whole show. The bits we do understand and the bits we don't. He stands behind it all. And so God is not a competing explanation with science, because Christian philosophers don't suggest God to explain the things that science has not yet explained. They postulate and they see God there as an explanation because God explains why science explains. The very success of science in showing us how deeply ordered and rational our universe is gives us an even further reason to suspect there is a deeper reason or rationality behind that order. And so, has science disproved God? Well, it's not really possible for science to bury God, because you need to go beyond the limits of science, beyond the natural world, to answer the God question. God is not a part of this material realm. God is spirit. And so you shouldn't expect to find God in a test tube with the natural sciences. The third thing that's really important to appreciate as we think about this topic of God and science is science has its limits. Science is a wonderful means of learning and acquiring knowledge and has given us so many technological and medical advancements which have helped us thrive and alleviate suffering. But a limit to science is obvious by its inability to answer the questions we all ask, like, what are we here for? What's the meaning of life? Where are we going? Or as Brisbane theologian Dave Benson puts it, science can discover how the planets move, but it cannot tell you how you should move on the planets. See, there is just limits to what science can and can't do. Right and wrong are not scientific questions. Beauty and art aren't scientifically determined or weighed up. Medical ethics is so hard precisely because you cannot determine the value of someone's life simply by their material makeup or functionality. So, for example, should someone be mandated to have any kind of vaccination against their will? Well, science can tell you what maybe can happen as an effect of the vaccine, or it can predict outcomes, but it can't tell you what you should or should not do, because that is a value statement or judgment. Sir Peter Medawar, in his advice to a young scientist, wrote, "You damage the reputation of science if you claim too much for it. There is no easier way to discredit science than to claim it can answer everything." The existence of a limit of science is made clear by its inability to answer childlike questions, as I referenced before. How did we get here? Why are we here? Where are we going when we die? See, one of the big distinctions that needs to be recognized and appreciated in this topic of God and science is the difference between agency and mechanism. I lived on the same street as Richard Dawkins a few years ago in Oxford, and he authored the book The God Delusion, which some of you may be familiar with. And replete throughout his book is the assumption that once you understand how something works physically or mechanically, then you've got rid of there being an agent behind it or involved in it. But it's a pretty serious error, and it's pretty obviously demonstrated with the example of when you learn how plane flight works, or you learn a little bit of the fluid mechanics, you don't think, there's no more need for the Wright brothers who invented the first aeroplane. In fact, understanding the mechanism of how flight works and plane technology doesn't diminish there being an agent behind it. It actually gives you a greater respect for the person who is involved in it. See, our experience of the natural world shows us that understanding how something operates does not eliminate there being an agency behind it. So for me to say you need to choose between God and science is like saying you need to choose between the Wright brothers or the fluid mechanics that cause lift on a plane's wings, or that you need to choose between software engineers who helped build and construct an iPhone, or Steve Jobs, who was part of designing it. See, it's a false dichotomy. It's an unnecessary, forcing you to choose between two things that aren't actually in competition, but actually complementary. So for me to say you need to choose between God and science is also like saying you need to choose between the tradesman who built a house or the architect who designed it. They're simply different kinds of explanation. They complement one another, and they should go together in order to give a more rounded explanation of reality. And so different kinds of explanation is fundamentally important in understanding what God and science explain. When Sir Isaac Newton discovered gravity, he didn't say, oh, we don't need God anymore. He said, what a marvelous God who does it like this. This is the last category I want us to think about. The results of science. We've looked at the history of science, the philosophy of science, the limits of science. Now the results of science. When I was studying in the UK, I was surprised to discover that some of the world's leading thinkers in science and philosophy, like John Lennox, who I mentioned, and Richard Swinburne, far from thinking that science had buried God, instead they argued that nature itself points towards there being a creation of the universe, or there being a creator. Antony Flew was one of the most well-known atheists and philosophers of the 20th century, until he became convinced that there was a God. He wrote this popular and a well-known book near the end of his life, when he actually, he says, followed the evidence where it led and became convinced that, well, he didn't quite become a Christian that we know of, but he became convinced that there was a creator or a designer behind our world. One of the pieces of evidence that we'll look at just briefly now that persuaded him was the very origins of the universe. Where does our universe come from? Well, there's three logical options, as philosophers put it. One is that the universe has just always existed without explanation. Two is that the universe popped into existence from nothing. And three is that the universe was created by God, by a non-material, non-time-bound being. See, Christianity actually arose during a Greek philosophical climate that said that the universe, or matter and energy, was eternal. And yet the biblical writers, Genesis and particularly John's Gospel, still maintain and assert that in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. See, this doctrine of what's called creation ex nihilo, that everything was created from nothing, had been ridiculed by many atheistic philosophers until right up into the 20th century, until it was discovered that the universe seems to have had a beginning in the finite past some 13.7 billion years ago. And so option one is really off the table now due to not only philosophical but scientific evidence that the universe began to exist. So the remaining explanations are that the universe just popped into existence out of nothing with no cause, or that it had a first cause. That the universe was created out of nothing is just what the Christian scriptures predict. Now, there's been some recent, semantic gymnastics to redefine nothing to actually mean something, whether a law of gravity or a quantum vacuum. But these attempts do really defy logic and descend into nonsense, for nothing cannot create anything, let alone everything. See, cause and effect philosophically lead to an infinite regress. What created the universe? Well, then there was this cause. Well, what caused that cause? And there was this cause. And so philosophically, you need an uncaused cause in the language of Aristotle. And so it seems at least reasonable, if not probable, to assume that the universe had a cause outside of itself. That's not a part of this material realm. And since time, space, and matter are all themselves a part of it, it means that this cause must be timeless, spaceless, immaterial, and immeasurably powerful. Well, that sounds a lot like the classical definition of God. See, we've just gone through some philosophical reasoning, but here's a small piece of scientific reasoning. When the scientists began to collect data and see lots of indicators that the universe had a beginning, John Lennox recalls being a young undergraduate at Cambridge University that this was fiercely resisted by a lot of the atheistic philosophers. It wasn't resisted by the scientists, it was the philosophers, because they said it would give too much credit to those who believe in God. But the evidence was so overwhelming that it was adopted and then disparagingly called the Big Bang, which the term has now been adopted. But I don't want to get into the timeline, as that'll divide the viewers here. But here are some evidences that convinced scientists that the universe began to exist. And the way that you can remember this, I pulled this from Frank Turek and Norm Geisler's good book, I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist, which kind of breaks down a little bit of a way to remember some evidence for the beginning of the universe. It's from the acronym SURGE. S standing for the second law of thermodynamics, U standing for the universe is expanding, R standing for radiation, the background radiation, G standing for great galaxy seeds, which they explain as part of galaxy formation, indicating a beginning to the universe, and E, Einstein's theory of general relativity. So the scientific data began to demonstrate conclusively that the universe had a beginning. And so what we would expect from Psalm 19, that the heavens declare the glory of God. The skies proclaim the work of his hands. Day after day they pour forth speech. Night after night they reveal knowledge. They have no speech, they use no words, no sound is heard from them, yet their voice goes out into all the earth, their words to the ends of the world. See, science and God, far from being competing explanations, are best seen as complementary explanations. They go together. Science is a kind of explanation that has great value, but it can't answer all the questions of life, particularly around meaning and purpose. That kind of intentionality needs to be revealed through another means, namely God's self-disclosure or self-revelation, if there is personal agency behind things in the first place. And this matters because the most important things that you and I look for and even pursue in life are not proved by scientific reasoning alone. Relationships, ethics, meaning and purpose, just because these things aren't proved and demonstrably worked out via the scientific method, it doesn't mean that you don't have good reasons for investing your life in them or trusting in committing yourself to a relationship, even though it can't be empirically weighed up. There's lots of natural evidence that you can study to make a good case that there is a God out there. But what really matters is not just whether God exists, but if it's possible for you to know him personally. If it's possible for you to have a relationship and be right with this God. If God has created the world, it means that he wanted you and this world to exist. There's intentionality and purpose behind it. It's not just random and chaotic. You exist for a reason. So we know so much about what we're made of. But what are we made for? We have everything to live with, but so many people feel they have nothing to live for. And maybe it's because they've been living out a narrative or a worldview that says there's no ultimate reason or purpose for you being here at all. You have to create your own meaning. But the problem with created meaning is that it is empirically unable to deal with the suffering that life throws at us. And so the best kind of meaning is not a meaning you create, it's one you discover. And so as we ask that question, what are we here for? Well, science can tell us a lot of things about our natural world, but it doesn't answer that question. So imagine you come to my house and you see the kettle boiling and you ask the question, why is the kettle boiling? I could give you a scientific explanation. I could say, oh, look, the electricity is causing the water molecules to conduct heat and then eventually vibrate faster and faster until some are released as steam, and that's why the kettle's boiling. Well, have I really answered your question? Well, I have on one level, but I could have answered another way. I could have said, oh, the kettle's boiling because I'm making a cup of tea. See, they're not competing explanations. They're complementary explanations. And together they give a fuller explanation of reality. And that is exactly what the Bible does. It tells us some essentials about our natural world and God's ownership and involvement with it. But it tells us about our world and about us in terms of agency. Who wanted this world to exist at all? Why is this here? Why is there something rather than nothing? So far from God and science being competing explanations, I believe they're best seen as complementary explanations. Because ultimately, science can tell you what you're made of, but it cannot tell you what you're made for. Amen.
Thank you so much, Jordan, for bringing that amazing word. One key takeaway, Caleb, for myself is that, wow, science really has its limits. And God explained what Science Explained. I thought that sentence in itself was quite mind-blowing for me personally. And God is the God of the whole picture, Jordan was mentioning. And I thought that was, wow, that was something that I have not seen, before this. So Caleb, what is your takeaway?
Oh, but before I share my takeaway, maybe you guys could share your takeaway as well. If you have one takeaway from the session just now, we would love to hear what that is. Please. So feel free to go onto the chat right now and just share what is one takeaway that you had from that session. So for me, I think, for me, it's quite, I have a few.
Okay.
But I think as I was taking some notes, one of the things that really stood out to me was this. When he shared, understanding how something works doesn't remove the need for an agency behind it, but it adds to the respect and appreciation of the agent behind it all. And I think that was so true for me, and it definitely is even my own personal experience growing up. So I would say that as a kid growing up, I was quite of a science. I like science quite a bit. I grew up reading the encyclopedia, not understanding everything, but just reading through it. But as I grew older and as I grew in my faith, I came to see how my understanding of science gave me a greater appreciation of the creator of the world that I live in. So I think that's something that was definitely true for me. So maybe you could hop onto the chat and see what our friends have taken away as well.
Yes, we've got Ken Lai who mentioned that science may give us the how things work or are created, but not the why or who created them. And exactly, like what Jordan mentioned as well, that science can tell you what you are made of, but it cannot tell you what you are made for. And when I heard that as well, I'm like, wow, a bit mind blown, So guys, continue to put in your takeaway, what struck you, what made you, mind blown a little.
For sure.
We would love to hear from you.
Nice. All right, so if you guys have any questions at this point of time, I think there are some questions regarding to the session already that has already been shared. But we would just like to share with you a bit.ly link that you can hop onto to add your questions there. So the bit.ly link should be coming out right now. It's bit.ly/YMI NextGen, all in uppercases.
And we will try and address as many as possible on this other link that will come up shortly after this as well. Again, you can find all of these links in our public chat. So just click on it and it will bring you right to it. And if any of you do not see it on your screen, do not worry. You probably have to exit your full screen mode and you would definitely see it on the right. So all the links are coming out shortly, and please feel free to click on it and access that document.
For sure. We are going to go on a 10-minute break in a bit. So feel free to take this time to stretch your legs, get a refill of your morning coffee, or maybe even take this time to drop a question using the link that we are about to share with you. And when we get back, we will jump right into the Q&A session with our speakers.
All right, and so with that, we would go for our break. It's time for me to fill this up with some magic juice, I would call it, and my magic juice is coffee. I'm not sure about you, Caleb.
Mine will just be water.
Okay, all right. So for the rest of you, please feel free, get a cup of something that will fuel you for our next session, which would be an Q&A, and we will see all of you in 10 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you.
Welcome back from the break. We hope that you had a good 10 minutes break and you have your coffee, your tea refilled, and you have stretched your legs and you are ready for what's coming up.
For sure. We hope that you guys feel refreshed.
Yeah.
So we hope that you guys are all back here already. We will move shortly into the Q&A sessions, right? So these questions were actually submitted by you guys. But maybe we'll just give a couple of minutes more for people to come back from your break. So if you're back, we would love to hear, would you just respond to us in the chat? Maybe you could give us a thumbs up, thumbs up. You could give us a clap or a heart emoji, and we can know that you guys are back already.
Yeah, I see quite a bit of emoji going off, meaning they're back and ready for our next segment. So thank you very much for responding with all the heart shapes and the cheer emoticon. Thank you, thank you, thank you. And we would love for you to continue to interact with us through the chat. So please feel free to put in your thoughts, your questions, and we would love to hear from you.
For sure. So now, as we mentioned, again, I think just to put it out there, if you guys have any questions, feel free to put those questions into the bit.ly link that will be shared. So that link would be bit.ly/YMI NextGen. All in uppercases. So put your questions there, and we would love to be able to address those questions, not in this session perhaps, but most definitely even in YMI's site. Okay.
And we see some questions already in there. So thank you very much for those of you who have put it in. For the rest of you, please feel free to do so.
So now we'll move into the Q&A session with our speakers. So without further ado, we'll pass the time over to Wei Sun to start the Q&A session.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Wei Sun, and it is my great pleasure and privilege to be the moderator for the next 50 minutes or so of Q&A. Welcome to the session. We did request for questions to be submitted beforehand, and y'all definitely did not disappoint. We got an overwhelming response for questions. So thank you so much for that. But that also means, unfortunately, that we won't be able to get through everybody's questions in this session. But no worries, we'll try our best to answer all submitted questions after the event on the YMI website. So we don't have that much time, so without further ado, let's dive right in. We have questions on topics of suffering and science and technology. The first question is already a tough one and relates to that difficult topic of suffering. So Max, let's see you take this first one. Question number one, why do some people have to suffer from illness, poverty, failure, separation, when none of it really is their fault at all?
Yeah, thanks so much, Wei Shun, and thanks for having me and Jordan on here for this Q&A. It's a really important question, and a question that I think is on all of our hearts at some point, if not all the time. This question of the indiscriminate nature of suffering. It's something that is common to the human condition. It's just part of the lived reality. There are a few things that can be said. The first thing to say is that the Bible is very, very clear that the world is not as it should be, and we are not as we should be. And so there is an intrinsic brokenness to the human condition and to the world that we experience. And that, explains in large part why there is so much suffering. However, that doesn't explain all of it. Now, there are 2 points, I think, to make on how we can actually make sense of the specific suffering that people seem to go through, seemingly needless suffering. A lot of it, we don't actually think about this, but a lot of it is actually our fault. So it might not be the fault of the sufferer directly, but it is human caused. The vast majority of suffering, of human suffering, is human caused. And so we all bear collective responsibility through our collective brokenness. All poverty, for example, all famine, all discrimination, all oppression, all subjugation, even this pandemic and this virus is all human caused. We are the ones that have built economic, financial, political, and geographic systems through which this suffering is perpetuated. Around 10,000 children, very sadly, will die today because of a lack of food and water. There's plenty of food and water to go around. There's no shortage. It's on us. We have built the systems that discriminate against people. And so a lot of the suffering we actually have to take collective responsibility for and understand that much of this suffering is caused by the intrinsic brokenness of humankind and our incapacity to tackle things like inequality and poverty and these sorts of human social ills, if you like. So that explains a lot of it. It's sad, but it's just reflective of human brokenness. There is, of course, always an aspect of suffering that is not human caused at all, either individually or collectively, and we just can't seem to make sense of it, whether it's genetic abnormalities or congenital birth defects or disease and illnesses borne by innocent people, children, probably the most obvious example. And with that suffering, the Bible does tell us that the world is broken. That is what is going to happen. And the honest answer is that we just don't always know exactly why specific instances of suffering are there. It's a bit like a spider in a garage. If I opened an empty garage and said, there's a spider in here, as I said in my talk, we might not see it, but it doesn't mean that those reasons are not there. And so what the Christian message says, what God calls us to, is to trust him with that uncertainty, to trust him even in the midst of the suffering that we don't seem to understand. He doesn't ask us to trust him blindly. He gives us a very strong and firm basis on which to trust him, and that, of course, is the cross of Jesus Christ. But there are always going to be aspects of the world, the brokenness of the world, that we just can't understand. Thankfully, though, that's not the end of the story. Through the gospel of Jesus, there is a message and a catalyst and a pathway, not just for comfort and strength in all of this, inexplicable suffering, but redemption and restoration through it. Hope that's helpful.
Yeah, I think that's an essential framework for us to have as a starting point. And one of the interesting things that seems to happen in the New Testament, particularly in the preaching and teaching of Jesus's ministry, was that he said there was something about those in the midst of suffering and feeling the brokenness of this world that made them more receptive and open to the news of the kingdom of God coming into our world. He actually says it's hard for the rich to enter the kingdom, and blessed are the poor in spirit. So there's this weird paradox actually in the New Testament that physical suffering and struggle is not the only metric by which God looks at our lives and determines whether it's got value and meaning in it. Actually, right, we are profoundly and at our essence spiritual beings made by God and for God, and we're embodied and our bodies matter, and God fearfully and wonderfully made us. But our spiritual lives are of such importance for eternity that neglecting it because we've got all the comforts and the creature comforts and luxuries that we would pursue now, Jesus actually says that can sometimes be such a distraction and even a stumbling block that it stops people from entering the kingdom. So, right, particularly in my context in Perth and Western Australia, I absolutely love this city, and there's so much to thank God for. As Romans 1 says, it should show us the fingerprints of God on creation that we give him thanks. But Australian evangelist John Chapman used to say, Australians don't want to go to heaven because they're already there. So right, there was this sense in which, according to Jesus, suffering is a powerful message that this world is not as it should be, and it should cause us to look for and long for the new creation that Jesus is bringing about through the gospel of the kingdom.
Thank you very much. I like that very much, this idea that suffering does point us, back to the cross and back to Jesus. But this is related to another question that we got, which is that, and this is the question, how is God's glory amplified through suffering, right? So we know it points us back to Jesus. But on the flip side, there are some people who look at suffering and then say, well, this is just proof that there is no God, because if there's a God, then, and who is all loving and all powerful, he wouldn't even let us go through this. So doesn't suffering actually take away from God's glory in that sense?
Yes.
Much less amplify it?
Yes. No, it's a great question, and thank you for submitting it. And I think it's honest that we deal with this question, because the reality of it is that most people that I talk to will raise this at one point or another in their struggle to believe in God being truly good and truly in control with all the mess that we see in our world. But one of the things that I find at least comforting, as Max addressed in that last question, is the Bible, the Christian scriptures are very honest about the fact that this world is not as it should be, but also that this didn't catch God by surprise. That's one of the seeming paradoxes going on, that it's not as though God has plan B now through Jesus to fix suffering, but in some way, God looked at this world, and in his thinking it up and design for it and love for us, he knew that the net benefit of all that was going to happen would still weigh for our good and his glory, even with the fall happening. And so it seems like the Bible never says that evil is now good or that suffering is now good, but rather that God can use evil for good ends. That we see in the scriptures God opposes evil, that's very clear, but also that God will end evil, and he does it throughout flanking it. Now, flanking is a rugby union term. I'm not sure if you guys are familiar with that term, but it means that in one sense you outmaneuver something so that you get to the end point, and by the time you've got there, you've managed to reconfigure things in such a way that not only did that suffering not win or the evil didn't prevail, but also you somehow God even uses the suffering for that good end. And I think we see an example of that in the story of Joseph with his brothers, where a real evil and injustice happens, where Joseph is sold into slavery and he's falsely accused by Potiphar's wife, and he's then forgotten by Pharaoh, who he helps. And you don't really see him complaining in the midst of his suffering, although he'd have grounds to. But eventually, once he's put in a position of power, his brothers are terrified that he's going to use his power to get vengeance on them. But he says this fascinating phrase in Genesis chapter 50, verse 20. He says, you don't need to worry, because what you intended for bad, you intended to harm me, God intended it for good and the saving of many lives. So in one sense, I don't know if when you're looking at your suffering in the moment and in the short term, I don't think we have much warrant from experience and from scripture to go, in the very short term, you're going to be able to make sense of it. But I think one of the things I've learned in my life, and I'm only 33, but as I look back on the last, 15, 20 years of teenage and adult years and things like that, I now see things that were really difficult and hardships that I went through. And if I could go back in time and change them, although I'd have that impulse to do so, I now see that they actually had a purpose. They not only refined my character, but they also helped me cling to God in a way I might never have before. So, that classic passage from Romans chapter 5, verse 3 to 5, it says, we glory in our suffering because suffering produces perseverance, character. Suffering produces perseverance produces character, and character produces hope. And the reason why hope is a good thing in the Christian worldview is because hope is not just wishful thinking. In Christianity, we have a sure hope that God will return and that we have an eternity to look forward to. So I think we always have to view suffering through the lens of eternity. Suffering in the midst of just this life in the here and now, it will not make sense. But if there is an eternity in front of us in which we can be in right and joyful relationship with God and others and our world in the new creation, then the Romans 8 idea comes in that in some way this will show God's glory, and we will look back and go, that was good.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, I totally agree with all of that. And totally affirm Jordan's point. I think that is the key takeaway, the first couple of points Jordan just made, which is that God's glory is actually amplified through suffering because he conquers it. It's just that simple. And it's right there when Jesus says, you are going to have tribulation in the world, but be of good cheer. I have overcome the world. So it is a story of love, but it is a story of conquest through love. And so this is a God that conquers through the suffering. That's how his glory is amplified. He doesn't try and dodge it. He's not defeated by it. He deals with it head on, and he conquers it. He conquers through the suffering. And in and through that, now suffering actually provides a wonderful opportunity and channel through which the love of Jesus and the love of God gets to be poured out into the world through his followers. And so that's the only other thing I would add, that suffering, as terrible as it is, it offers undoubtedly the greatest possible channel for the love of God to be poured out through his followers into the world. At no time and through no other human experience is the love of Jesus more needed, and does the love of Jesus shine more brightly than when people are suffering and those exuding the love of Christ come alongside them. So those are the only things I would add.
Yeah, no, that, as you said that, Max, it made me think that was the verse I was searching for, Romans 8:18. I consider our present sufferings aren't worth comparing with the glory that will be revealed.
Right.
So yeah, there's this sense in which we have to make sense of our present suffering in light of the glory to come.
That's awesome. Very beautiful, and also a great reminder that, for us as Christians, that we have a role to play in helping people through their suffering as well, shining the love of God, in those moments. Let's shift tracks a little bit away from suffering. We'll come back to it later. But the topic of science and technology as well is sometimes also seen to be at odds with the Bible and with our belief in God. So first question on this topic then, how do we reconcile scientific evidence of evolution and what we see in the Bible, which is the creation story? And Jordan, maybe you can go first on this one.
Yeah, right. Well, I'd be interested to see Max's approach on this too as a lawyer. He'll be able to craft his words together and make a compelling case. But look, for me, I really approach this and I try and break it down into three ways of thinking. And I just think in terms of the existence of God and the case out there for the neo-Darwinian view of evolution, the kind of molecules to man, the mindless, unguided process view, I try and break it down to these three levels of philosophical thinking, theological or biblical thinking, and then just weighing up the scientific data. Now, philosophically, it is not a defeater for belief in God if there is naturalistic evolution. The presence of a natural process by which intelligent life came about is not a philosophical defeater for there being a eternal spiritual being who is all good and all powerful. So philosophically, it's actually not a contradiction. Where people really start to run into a little bit of grey area and start to have some lively questions and discussion is around whether the theory of evolution is compatible with the biblical account of creation. Do you have to dismiss Genesis in order to fit in there, or do you have to reread Genesis, through a different understanding that maybe the main agenda of this text is actually not to tell us about the purely physical phenomena of our world, or maybe it's got more scientific or anthropological emphasis. And so then Christians in-house wrestle with this question. So, I'm sure in our churches there are Christians of good, clear conscience who are genuinely trying to uphold the authority and the inerrancy of Scripture and trying to make sense of what do we do with the data from our natural world about how old it is, and maybe the process by which biological life came to now be in this intelligent form of human beings. So then that's a live discussion in-house. So there's philosophical reasons. It doesn't compete with, I don't think it undermines the existence of God at all. It's perfectly possible that God could have used that process if he saw fit. biblically and theologically, that's where the discussion is, and it's an in-house discussion. You do not need to hold a particular view of creation in order to be a Christian. Christians hold different perspectives. And then the third point is this. I think it's a good thing that we genuinely engage in and weigh up the scientific evidence for any theory that we hold. And that's how science is done. It continually reevaluates and re-examines based on new information that's being presented to us. And I think all of the information that we're eventually getting is showing more and more clearly that life is so much more complex and finely tuned than we ever previously thought, that the idea that you get an intelligent mind from a mindless, unguided process was actually really difficult to sustain philosophically, and also just from observational science, it does not happen in nature, that information comes from random chaos. We also know that the whole cosmology around us now shows that the universe had a beginning. And it's just rules of philosophical logic, and also it can be demonstrated scientifically due to cause and effect, that if the universe began to exist, all things that begin to exist have a cause, and that cause needs to be outside of the universe. So when you put all these things together in a cumulative case, far from science and God being in competition, which I mentioned in my talk, I actually think they complement each other. And when it comes to God and science with regards to evolution, I actually think we need to re-examine how we're reading the Genesis text. Are we taking it so literalistically that the original recipients wouldn't have dealt with it that way, or that the genre of text, we're reading it as moderns and not appreciating that this is a piece of ancient literature, and the author had an intent that I think when we weigh it up in light of all scripture, we can see that it's primarily a theological text telling us something about God, and it's also telling us something about human beings, and it tells us things about nature, but I don't think the exact process is given in such detail that we're locked into a straitjacket that we can't investigate the scientific evidence for how evolution might have played a part.
Yeah, I think that's a hugely helpful framework that Jordan just laid out, very comprehensive. And so there's not a lot for me to add, but I guess, Jordan asked what would I say as a lawyer. The only sub-point I would make to Jordan's final point really is just on this idea of the qualitative difference between what the creation account is trying to do in Genesis and what scientific theories generally, but specifically the varying scientific theories on evolution are trying to do. The Genesis creation accounts are not trying to, nor do they, explain how the universe was brought into existence. The purpose of the account is to explain why it was brought into existence, what actually happened, and most importantly, who is the agent that sits behind the bringing of the universe into existence. Whereas natural sciences are looking at something completely different. They're looking at how things work and how things happen. So understanding the difference between mechanism and agency, as you know, a former professor of ours, John Lennox, who taught Jordan and I, he breaks this down, this difference between mechanism and agency. Genesis is really about the agent. It's about who brought it into being. The natural sciences are about the mechanism, how they happen. And so I think you can make a very strong argument that there actually is no need for the process of reconciliation any more than there is a need to reconcile the former existence of Steve Jobs with the existence of the iPhone, or to reconcile the operation of the internal combustion engine with the existence of Henry Ford, or to reconcile the existence of Microsoft Windows with the existence of Bill Gates and the Microsoft Corporation. Their agent is the person or the entity that brings something into being, and then the mechanism is how we understand how it works. And so Genesis is just trying to tell us what happened and who made it happen and why he made it happen. Science is trying to tell us how it happened. And even sciences, there are varying accounts. There are different kinds of evolution, macroevolution, microevolution. And as Jordan correctly says, different people, Christians and non-Christians, have different views on all of those things. And that's perfectly fine. So let's not get hung up about it. But the most important takeaway was actually Jordan's first line, which is, this is not a deal breaker. It's not a deal breaker for the truth value of the Bible, and certainly not a deal breaker for the truth and the power of the gospel. But an important question.
It's so important, and we've answered this. This has been a way too long an answer, but I'll just say, look, when I first went to uni at 18 years old, I was studying chemical engineering, and I remember sitting in, inorganic chemistry classes and fluid dynamic classes where they were, speaking about how fish fins affect their ability to survive in water. And I remember just feeling this very close to heart, that thinking you need to choose between either a theory of evolution and belief in God is an unhelpful, it's a false dichotomy. You do not need to choose between one or the other. And yeah, look, there's a robust discussion going on as to the mechanism behind natural life.
Thanks very much. It has been a long answer, but to be fair to us, we did kind of touch on two questions, because there was another question which talked about how we handle questions about scientific theories that seem to contradict the Bible, and I think a very helpful framework that we've kind of laid out. Perhaps it would be helpful for us as Christians, to have a simplified, let's say a TLDR, if you will, of such a framework. If we get a question about scientific theories that contradict the Bible thrown at us, how should we respond? A simple one.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. I've got a short algorithm that I try to use that I think is helpful, and it gets back to the final things that George and I were saying to the previous question. And we really just need to look at the purposes for which natural sciences exist. Mm-hmm. The natural sciences are exclusively focused on and designed for understanding, observing, and cataloguing the natural universe. Whereas God, the God of the Bible, exists primarily in the supernatural, in the metaphysical, in the supernatural realm. And so necessarily, the physical sciences are not really designed or concerned with proving, disproving, understanding God on any level, because they're about the physical world, whereas God exists in the metaphysical, in the supernatural. And so because of that, as Jordan said, there's a qualitative difference. It's a false dichotomy to try and match one off against the other. So trying to prove or disprove God's existence using any scientific theory deductively won't work. It's like trying to find cheeseburgers with a metal detector. You just won't find one. Doesn't matter how good your metal detector is, because metal detectors are not designed to find cheeseburgers. In the same way, the natural sciences are just not designed to find or unfind God. So it's completely different things.
Although who knows what's in cheeseburgers these days?
That's true. That's true. Depends on the cheeseburger.
But my one-liner would be this: the natural sciences can tell you a lot about what the universe is, but you need God in order to tell you what the universe is for. And so if you want those are the most important questions of life. And so really, I think we do ourselves and science a disservice when we try to get it to explain more than it can.
Thank you so much for that. Let's go back to our topic of suffering with our next question. And we touched on this a little bit earlier, but I think it might be important for us to dive a little deeper. We were talking about, especially when things aren't fair, and it's just it's a sad situation when people are born into into suffering, right? But why is it that the question is, why is it that some people are born into suffering and unprivileged situations like poverty or war or disease, and others are not? And I guess, how do people who are born into these situations deal with it?
That's a really good question. Maybe I'll offer a few preliminary thoughts, Max, and then I'd love you to jump in.
Sure.
One thing I think we need to do, just in order to get a framework, is to look at the fact that Paul says very clearly to a group of philosophers and thinkers in Athens that God determined the exact time and place where each of us should live so that we could reach out for him and find him, for he's not far from each one of us. So that means that the circumstances in which you live, when and where, and also how you've been made, were done in such a way with an intentionality behind it that it is possible for you to reach out for God and find him, for he's not far from each one of us. So again, if the main reason that we were created is, it says in Colossians 1:15, we were created by him and for him. We were created by Jesus and for him. Then the first thing that we need to ask is, does any of our physical situations cut us off from the possibility of a relationship with God? And I'd say no. But the second thing that's also very important is that things like poverty and war and handicaps, they're not as much of a defeater for people actually finding meaning and purpose in life as you would think. So they recently did a huge study. Actually, I think it was quite a while ago, 2003 in North America, a controlled study of people with Down syndrome. And they asked them about how they felt about life in general, were they happy, and also how they felt about their physical appearance. The outcome was staggering. 98% of people with Down syndrome expressed that they were happy, and 96% of them said that they were happy with the way that they looked. Now, my brother is a disability and support worker. It gives his life great joy and meaning to be working with people in these situations. But I'll tell you what, if you went out to our general public and the general population and you asked them if they're happy in life and they were happy with the way they look, do you think that you would get 98% of people saying they're happy and 96% of people saying happy the way they look? Absolutely not. And so I reckon sometimes we fail to appreciate the fact that life with suffering can still have great meaning, and it can still be of immense value to that person and to those around them. Matt?
Yeah, that's so important, George, and I think that's absolutely spot on. The follow-on, I think, or the sequel to that answer is the only thing I would add, which is it's one thing for us to speculate and think about and even just contemplate why this underprivilege is there and why there are these struggles. But just take as an example someone who has a flat tire, right? When you see someone on the side of the road with a flat tire, certainly the couple of times I've had flat tires, what is that person trying to do? They're trying to fix the flat tire. They're trying to put the spare tire on, or they're waiting for roadside assistance. They're trying to get on with their journey. Never do you see someone with a flat tire walking back down the road 3 miles, 4 miles, trying to find out why the tire is flat, being a detective, trying to work out if it was a nail or glass. No one cares. The point is the tire is flat. You've got to fix it and move on. So not to disrespect the questioner at all, because it's an important question, but understanding people who are in underprivileged situations or disadvantaged situations or suffering is one thing. But the Christian mandate is actually to go and alleviate that suffering. The Bible tells us there is brokenness in the world and there is intrinsic brokenness in people. Because of that, there are going to be situations of disadvantage and suffering. Our job as Christians is not to think about it and talk about it. It's to go out there and help those people. And there are always people that we can come alongside and help. The Bible is clear again and again and again. We are called to loosen the chains of injustice, to lift people up, to find the oppressed, to reach out. The love of God made real in and through his disciples is the salve for the underprivileged and the struggle. This is work that Jesus will ultimately finish and redeem and mop up into perfection. But if you're a follower of Jesus, our first job is to go and alleviate suffering and underprivilege. Talking about it may be helpful to get a better grasp on the issue, but we need to be coming alongside people and helping them. To start the work of renewal and redemption that Jesus will ultimately finish.
Yes, my one-liner is, I reckon one of the things that is most depressing is the people sitting around pontificating about all these people suffering who won't actually get their hands dirty and do what they can to help them.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think thanks so much for that. I think that also answers a different question that we got, which was, what difference does Christianity make on our outlook on suffering?
Yeah.
Right. So pointing it back to God, knowing that, there's great meaning in suffering, and also, it just, I guess, pushes us to help people.
Yeah, the responsibility aspect. Like the world has blown up the last couple of years because of, the Canadian professor and psychologist Jordan Peterson. And the essence of his message is that you find meaning in life through the adoption of a significant responsibility. And primarily that responsibility that gives life a sense of meaning is relational, looking out for other people and doing something that can actually contribute to their well-being and their good. That's where you'll find actually significance and meaning in life. Now, I would say as an appendix that he doesn't mention as clearly, if we're image bearers of God, we were made by a relational God for relationships. So it makes perfect sense on the Christian framework of life that we would invest our energy and find a sense of meaning in looking out for the well-being of others. And hey, this is exactly what Jesus said when he was asked about the greatest commandments. What are the greatest commandments? Love God, primarily relational. Secondarily, love your neighbor as yourself. So I think, again, we do get a clue to not just the meaning of our lives, but the meaning of all life through suffering. And my brother, who recently became a disability support worker, 35, wasn't a Christian till his early 30s, very difficult life with incredible health issues and even mental health issues as well. He's had his struggles. And one of my greatest fears when I lived over in the UK 10 years ago was wondering, will my brother be home when I get back? Because his mental health was that bad. And just recently, watching him have become a disability and support worker, living with people with really significant health issues, he said, I felt like I found my calling in life. And there's been, how many lives have been saved in this situation that now he has meaning and purpose and they have someone who loves them in this way. So it's been a real lesson for me watching on.
Yeah, that's awesome.
That was a bonus. That was a bonus answer. You didn't even ask that question.
Yeah. All right, we got a really interesting question here. Is it bad to believe in the multiverse? And of course, that's an interesting question because we've got a lot of movies coming up about the multiverse. Yeah, Max, maybe you can take this one.
Yeah, it's an interesting question because the word bad is a moral term and multiverse theory is not a moral theory. It's a scientific contemplation, if you like. And so it's a bit like saying, is it bad to like oranges or not? So it kind of mixes categories a little bit. So if I was in a debate and someone asked me, I'd disagree with the question. But assuming that we could clean up the question a little bit, look, again, as Jordan said in his very first answer, as we both said in our first answers on science and scripture, it's not a deal breaker. Like, it's not, for the same reasons that we've already outlined. There's no inconsistency with the existence of a multiverse as it is contemplated and with what scripture says, the truth of the gospel of Jesus Christ. There's absolutely no contradiction. The thing with the multiverse is, as far as I'm aware, and I'm by no means an expert on the multiverse theories, and again, there are multiple multiverse theories out there. The problem that I see with them is there isn't really particularly compelling evidence for them at this stage. But that's me as a non-scientist and a non-astronomer making a personal judgment on astronomy. So I acknowledge I'm speaking outside my expertise, but I don't think it's bad to believe in anything provided that there's sufficient evidence for it. That's the short answer I would give. So I'd read up on the evidence, and if the evidence is sufficiently compelling, then sure, you make an inference to the best explanation. My limited understanding of the multiverse theories that are there now is that there isn't particularly strong evidence to suggest it. The other thing to be aware of with multiverse theories is they're often put forward by naturalists, or they come from a naturalistic frame by people who really just don't want to acknowledge God or the possibility of God's existence. And there is an intrinsic contradiction there with multiverse theories in that context, to the degree that it comes from a naturalistic worldview. Because as soon as we start talking about a multiverse, this idea that there are other physical universes other than this one, you are in a metaphysical space. You're in the supernatural. So as soon as you start talking about multiverses, you can no longer be a naturalist, because you can no longer be in that space that says we are nothing but time plus matter plus chance, because the multiverse in all of its forms as it's currently contemplated necessarily postulates a supernatural realm or a metaphysical realm, something outside of the natural world. And so straight away, you kind of contradict yourself as a naturalist. And also there isn't that much evidence for it anyway. So whether it's bad or good is not for me to say, but I'd say whatever you're going to believe in, check the evidence and then make a call. But it's of absolutely no relevance to the truth of the gospel of Jesus Christ.
Right. Yeah, and so philosophically, God is a non-material being and therefore doesn't compete with any material realm to, attribute or derive his
Right.
existence
Right.
or sustenance from. You know, his self-definition in Exodus is I am who I am, being that God is not defined with reference to anything external to himself. But it's fascinating. I was just referencing a book by, again, John Lennox on a science-buried God. And one of the things that philosopher Alvin Plantinga mentions is the hypothesis of certain multiverse is that an infinite number of potential multiverses exist. And if it's possible that an infinite number of multiverses exist, then it means that there is a universe in which God exists. And
Right.
therefore,
Right.
because if you have an infinite number, there's an infinite number of possibilities. So in one sense, it ends up being a little bit self-defeating, and I don't think it's as much of an escape hatch as sometimes people postulate.
Yeah, to be honest, I think most people, lay people who haven't done the research or haven't looked at the evidence, we just want to believe that it might be true because then there's an alternate reality where I'm more handsome than I already am. Or richer, or have less suffering.
Yeah.
But yeah, I do think the same thing. There's really no evidence of it.
By definition, there can't be, because the multiverse is a universe outside of our observational and experience interaction. Therefore, it's always going to be, in one sense, philosophical and speculative. So yeah, it kind of, you can't really expect to get any evidence of it because it's by definition outside of our realm of engagement.
Right.
Yeah. But I think that's the great thing about science, right? Because as we speculate about more things and generate more theories and test them out, then we start to discover more and more about the world. And this comes back to one of the questions that's been submitted, a really good one, which is if science eventually reveals all the secrets of the universe, then where does that leave God?
Maybe I'll just quickly jump in there because, again, like the last question, I think the premise of the question is a false, flawed premise. Science cannot reveal all the universe's secrets. This is something called scientism, that everything that we can or that we need to know can be answered by science. And it's beyond the scope of science to do that. Science has limits in terms of logic and mathematical truths and aesthetic values and ethical questions. These things aren't actually addressed by science. We know so much about what we're made of, but what are you made for? And science just is unable to give you an answer to that question. So I think it is worth then looking in other realms of evidence for that answer.
Yeah, that's a great answer. I don't have anything to add to that.
Comes back to the name, like YMI, right? Why do I exist? Yeah.
Absolutely.
Great link, great plug. All right. Well, as young people, I think it's really pertinent for us because we are also in this generation where science and technology is moving so much faster than anything that our parents or grandparents have been through. What do we need to be careful about technology in this era?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, the thing about technology is it's not new and it's not modern. The word techne or technique or technology or technocratic, it's all about making and doing. And so human history has always involved us improving our quality of life based on these very basic concepts of making and doing. And so, yes, we've had 3 rounds, arguably, of industrial revolution since the 1600s. Then we had a computing revolution. Then we had a digital and a communications revolution. And now we're in the middle of our second round of the artificial intelligence revolution. And so technology is more and more involved and a part of our lives. And I think you could make the case that while technology's always been there in some sense, the nature of technology over the last 20 to 30 years is such that its influence on our everyday lives is greater. If not greater, it's certainly increasing at an exponential rate. And that's evidenced most obviously by digital media, by social media, by the influence and the power of the digital realm in our everyday lives. In terms of understanding how we need to be careful about it, how we need to utilize it, I think it's really about taking technology back to first principles and remembering that technology is amoral. So it's not immoral and it's not benevolent. So it's not bad or good. So it's an incorrect question to say, is technology bad or is technology good? Technology is amoral, which means we bring moral content to it in how we use it, how we utilize it, how we develop it, and how we make it part of our lives. So whether it's a smartphone or a laptop or AI technology or the algorithms that underpin the apps that we use, we always bring moral content. So technology, if we think of it like a car engine, the degree to which it's damaging or helpful or positive or negative is really determined by the petrol that we pump through the engine. And petrol is the moral content. And when I say moral content, I mean the systems by which we define what's good and what's bad, the systems by which we understand what a person is, what it means to be human. Are we all of equal value? What's the role of love? What's the role of compassion? What's the role of forgiveness and relationality and all of those things? So technology, like a knife and fork or chopsticks or a shovel or a computer, is not intrinsically bad or good. It all depends on what you use it for and how it impacts you. So we just need to be careful when we are using it that we don't allow technology to detract from the first principles of our lives. And the follow-on, of course, is that we need to have first principles in our lives. And the Judeo-Christian framework, the Judeo-Christian moral framework and the gospel of Jesus Christ offers those first principles that can help us anchor our technology and use it for good, use it to enhance relationality, to alleviate suffering, to help people, to connect to people, and so forth, rather than to detract from all of those things. So technology can be bad. It can be bad for relationships. It can be bad for our brains. It can be bad for our purpose, our meaning, our callings, but it can also be good for all of those things. So I think remembering that technology is just an instrument, it's up to us to bring the moral content to technology to make sure that it is ultimately a force for good. In the end, technology will never be a force for good or evil. It's always human beings that are a force for good or evil. And so it's up to us as to what we do with technology. So remaining grounded in those first principles and talking about those first principles in the context of artificial intelligence, algorithms, technological advancement, talking about them continuously will help to re-anchor us as well. Just some thoughts.
Yeah, I've got nothing to add there. Max is the guy to speak to on this question. And if you probably YouTube Max's name and artificial intelligence, I reckon some stuff will probably pop up where he dives into this a bit further. Yeah, Max?
Possibly, yeah. I think so. Thanks, George.
I think one thing that suffering brings about and also technology can bring about is the sense of loneliness and isolation. And so the question is it okay if I still feel lonely or feel lonely throughout all of this? Does it mean that I'm just not content enough in Christ?
Let me say a couple of things, and then let me say a couple of things and I'll hand it to Jordan. He's a pastor, so he'll be able to answer this in depth. But just very briefly, in my view, it doesn't mean that you're not content in Christ, because we all still have emotions. Our bodies are still broken. As George said earlier, we are embodied. And so we are subject to the ups and downs of human hurt and happiness and loneliness and struggles and suffering, just like anyone else is, regardless of whether you're a Christian or not. And some of this stuff is biochemical. It could require professional treatment, mental health treatment, and so forth. And so there's that aspect of it too. But there is always a contentment and a joy in Christ that I think we should be aware of. Doesn't mean we're always going to be happy, but we always have that eternal certainty. And I think there is a joy in that, which I think is really important. And the only other thing I'll say, which I'm sure Jordan will expand on, is that the Christian life is not meant to be lived alone. There's no excuses for people not having Christian community. A friend of Jordan and mine, Sam Albury, said to me very powerfully, we were catching up once, that there's a lot of suffering, and we've talked about a lot of it today, that we can't do anything about. Loneliness is not in that category. We have no excuses as a family of God and a kingdom of God for people to be lonely. And so the Christian life is designed, as we have said repeatedly, for relationality, up close and personal relationship with God and loving relationships with one another. And so for people who are lonely, it's up to the family of God to reach out to them, and they should be encouraged and invited to reach out to others. But that's why living life solitarily is not a Christian way to live. We need to be plugged into a local church. We need to be plugged in to a community group or a cell group within that local church. We need to have Christian friends and non-Christian friends around us living in community. Human beings, just weren't designed to be solitary. But Jordan, as a pastor, I'm sure you have plenty to say on this.
Well, I'll add a few brief thoughts because I'm aware of our time and us finishing up. Sometimes we all feel lonely, but we all need to remind ourselves of the core truth of the Christian faith is that just because you feel lonely, it doesn't mean you are alone. Jesus promises that he will ask the Father to send another advocate to help you. And it says these words about the Holy Spirit, and he will be with you forever. So even at times when you feel lonely, it does not mean that you're alone. And so it's really important and right that when you feel that you remind yourself of the objective truth and reality that Jesus promises that I will be with you. I will never leave you or forsake you. So that's, I think, an important first step. The next thing is that being content in Christ means not that we are happy with everything going on in our lives or in the world. Being content in Christ means that we're not constantly yearning for things that God doesn't promise or things that he has prohibited. But being content in Christ means taking hold of the present blessing and provision that he has given you in your circumstance. But there is right sense of longing for community and for relationship that God has built into us as his image bearers. And that is actually a longing that should cause us to pray what Jesus taught his disciples to pray in the Lord's Prayer, thy kingdom come, thy will be done. When we pray thy kingdom come, we're saying, God, we're looking forward to the time when you put things right. And what is the kingdom of God? It's clear throughout the scripture. It's God's people. It's a community thing in God's place under God's rule and blessing. And so when you feel lonely, remind yourself that you are not alone. And also that longing that you have for deep connection and relationship is a good and a right longing that God has given you. And the church is called to meet that need.
That's great.
Thanks very much, folks. All right, and that about wraps up our session. Thank you, Max. Thank you, Jordan, for spending time with us. And thank you to everybody who's submitted your questions. If your question did not get answered throughout the session, we'll be covering all of those, as many as we can at least, after the event on the YMI website. So thanks, everybody. We'll pass the time back to Caleb and Karen.
Our pleasure, brother. Thanks for having us.
Thanks.
Thank you so much, Wei Shun, Max, and Jordan. That was really quite a session, Caleb.
Right.
I enjoyed the questions. I think there are a lot of questions.
And I enjoyed the answers. There
Oh, wow,
were
that's
a
great.
lot of good answers there as well.
That's great. I hope all of you have also had a good time, an insightful time with the questions and answers that were shared with our speakers. So as we are at the end of our time together, YMI has a specially dedicated microsite that addresses tough questions about the faith through articles as well as audio recordings of previous Examining the Faith events. So please feel free to check that out. You can also read articles and hear previous talks by Max. And if you have more questions that haven't been addressed at today's event, we strongly encourage all of you to take note of the link that is coming up in the chat again and check it out after today's event.
Yeah, and again, we've said this a couple of times now, just to remind you again, if you have more questions that have not been addressed in today's session or in the Q&A, please head on to the bit.ly link that will be shared in the chat as well. It is bit.ly/YMI NextGen, all in uppercases. So we will try to address as many questions as possible on the YMI site. So save the link that will be coming up in the chat and visit it frequently to get updates and to see whether your questions are addressed there or not. Also, for those of you who have signed up for this event in advance and much earlier, you will also receive a link to the recording sometime next week. So do look forward to that as well.
That is right. We really appreciate all the participations that are happening in the chat. We saw so many active participations from all of you, we truly appreciate that. So we would love to hear your feedback. Share with us on the link that will be posted in the chat right now as well. It is askthey.typeform.com/2/me with all the numbers. The link is coming right up. Don't worry, guys.
Yes,
you
the
don't
link
have.
will come up,
Yeah,
so
you
don't
don't
worry.
have to write that down. We have thoroughly again enjoyed ourselves, both Caleb and myself, through the sessions, emceeing and connecting with you virtually. So thank you once again for being with us. It is now the afternoon, for spending that 2.5 hours with us. And we hope that, if we do have another event next year, hopefully physically, where we can meet all of you face to face, we would love that. We look forward to that.
Definitely.
And with that, Caleb and I would like to wish you an early blessed Christmas. Take care and stay safe and stay negative.
But be positive.
All right. Yeah, and be positive too as well. Thank you so much, guys. Thank you. We hope to see you next year, and have a good rest of the weekend ahead. Thank you.
Okay, goodbye.
Bye. Woo!